Oh, that's... We'll see. I'm gonna have to guess at where the camera's pointed. Oh, of course it's not connecting. Is that gonna work? Let's see. Oh, look at that. Cool. All right, it's...
Shall I do a last call?
Yeah, sure. I will holler.
Yeah.
All right, I'm just gonna start. So,
Evolution of JavaScript.
the evolution of JavaScript. A brief history, TC39. Oh, my first typo. There we go. So I've been doing JavaScript for a very long time, and I'm actually curious, how many folks here are like primarily JavaScript developers? Like, okay, so most folks. How many of you like find that there's like new features coming out that you get excited about? You're like, oh, I can't wait till that's mainstream. Okay. How many of you actually know like what leads up to those features appearing in the language? Yeah. So for those who are watching this, it was basically a few hands and then no hands. And I was in that same boat. So I think I first really felt this with optional chaining. That sort of showed up on my radar in like 2015, and I was just like, oh my God, I cannot wait for this to be a thing. And then a few years later, like 2018 or so, like it was in most of the browsers, it was in the the LTS version of Node, and like you could just use it, and it was great. And so like since that time, I've found myself sort of catching wind of these new features and figuring out like oh, what's going on, and trying to figure out when they're going to be available. And that led me to that's basically what led to this presentation, is sort of understanding that process. So JavaScript is overseen, like the umbrella organization is ECMA, hence why it's called ECMAScript, to those like sort of nerdy enough to care about those sort of things. And ECMA is an association that was started like way back in the early days of computers in Europe to basically provide standards that allowed all the different proprietary computer equipment that European manufacturers were creating to interact with one another. And so they've been doing lots of standards for a long time. They've got like 400 standards they've been publishing. And the 262nd of those is ECMAScript. And so that is the organization, that's where JavaScript comes from these days. And the committee that manages that particular specification, ECMA 262, is called Technical Committee 39, i.e. TC39. Hey, I'm going to use my phone like it's actually meant to be used. There we go. Right, so TC39 is a self-described group of basically JavaScript aficionados who collaborate with the community to maintain and evolve the definition of JavaScript. Now, I had a slide in here that was like, who exactly is that? But it turns out that like the most up-to-date version I could get was from a draft version of the TC39 website that one of the committee members had created in 2013. So like, needless to say, it's not a reliable source. At that time, there were like 20 some members from Google and Microsoft and like the University of Belgium, and some guy named Norbert who was actually like really good at internationalization and localization. So that was that was like 10 years ago. It was sort of like, there was like a few people. That's no longer what that's no longer what it looks like. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But let me first cover what TC39 does. So TC39 is JavaScript, the language. It covers the language level syntax and behavior, stuff like async await, like optional chaining, which I just mentioned. And it also covers the built-in APIs, so things like promise, math, string, regular expressions. And they publish the specification. So that's what they do. What they don't do is anything outside of that. So they don't cover anything that you would require or import, like in Node. So HTTP and the FS module or the net module, like none of that stuff is covered by the ECMAScript spec. And they don't do anything related to the browser. So they don't do DOM APIs. They don't do HTML5. all that stuff is covered by the W3C and WhatWig, which are completely separate organizations. TC39 is the JavaScript language. So if we look at the history of TC39 and ECMAScript, it's actually pretty interesting. I've been doing this, I started here. That's where I first started writing JavaScript. So I've kind of seen this whole timeline take place, and it's, as somebody who really likes JavaScript, it's been interesting. So JavaScript was invented in 1995 by Brandon Ike, and not long after it fell into the purview of ECMA and TC39. And they had a few good years here where they came out with ECMAScript 2 and 3. And in that time, this was kind of during the browser wars. It was when Microsoft was coming out with JScript as sort of their proprietary version in IE, when Macromedia came out with ActionScript for Flash, which later fell into the purview of Adobe. So there was this very political gamesmanship going on around the language. And needless to say, I think TC39 kind of got dysfunctional. There was a political divide that happened sort of in the 2000 to 2003 timeframe, where they just couldn't agree on how to, what the priorities and how to actually evolve the spec should be. There was supposed to be a version 4 in the 2003, around 2003, and that ended up getting abandoned because of this. And so there's about a decade-long period here where JavaScript just didn't evolve, which is ironic because that's when it really was taking off. I mean, the browser wars and web apps, like between 2000 and 2009, just completely different universes in terms of the number of people that are writing JavaScript, the kinds of JavaScript they're writing, and yet the language was entirely static. And worse, it was actually kind of different across browsers. Like you had to do feature checks in your code to see if you could do try catch around certain APIs, and all sorts of crazy stuff. It was nuts. And so eventually around 2009, they kind of got their shit together and they came out with ECMAScript 5, which was the first, I'd say the first mainstream version of JavaScript that really led to consistent JavaScript environments across all these browsers. And it was also around this time that Node was released. So we started to see backend JavaScript appearing as well. So having a consistent version of the language started to become important. And the reason I have Google Chrome on this slide is I think that sort of that influenced the way in which the committee and the community as a whole perceived specifications and standards bodies. Because we went from this sort of early era where standard bodies tended to be gatekeepers, where you couldn't really have something in a browser unless it was a standard for it, to where today standard bodies I think see themselves more as documenters of in the wild behaviors and as facilitators of sort of a consistent, making sure that behaviors are consistent, and that's reflected in the process, which I'll get to in a second. So ES5 came out around this time. Google Chrome went from sort of a click to download model to we're just going to update that for you, and you don't really have a choice. And we started seeing rapid release cycles of software. So Firefox, for example, was released in the 2005 timeline. And I think they had when they went to an auto update model, they had a 6-week release cycle. And now both Firefox and I think Chrome are on a 4-week release cycle. So updates happen pretty frequently. And I mention that because we're seeing something similar now. Starting in 2015, TC39 has gone to a yearly release cycle for the specification. So every June, and right now, there is a new specification that should drop. They actually met in March. What's that say? Yeah, right. Can't wait for Beyonce to release JavaScript 2022. Right, so the TC39 met in March to approve the new version of the spec. I haven't been able to find an exact date when they're going to announce it, but it's coming any minute now. And so it's cool. Every summer, you get your new version of JavaScript. So that's sort of the timeline. The process, formally, TC39 meets every 2 months to discuss any proposals that are on the table. You can take part in those meetings if you're willing to pay the entry fee, which is $3,500 to 70 grand a year, depending on how big your wallet is. I don't know. Kyle, is he here? Like talking nonprofits? I had this bullet point just for him. Like nonprofits, there's a free plan if we want to, if BendJS wants to get in on this process, man, there's an idea.
Coinbase is on there.
What's that?
Coinbase is on there.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
They have deep pockets. It's probably 70,000
Yeah. So that's the bad news. Like you got to figure out how to, if you want to be part of the meetings, like okay, you got to pay. I'm pragmatic enough to think that's probably a good thing to have a little bit of a threshold to get into those meetings. Mostly because there is a ton of discussion around these proposals that takes place out in the open. The proposals are actually managed on GitHub, where you file GitHub issues, you submit PRs, their discussion takes place. Like that's how proposals for new language features get evolved and developed. And in fact, the TC39 organization has like 200 and some repos that each repo has a proposal in it. So if you're curious, that's where you go. And that's actually that was sort of my entry point to this topic, was their homepage, which like lists out all these proposals. And I started trolling through them. I was like, this is interesting and like incredibly tedious at the same time. So GitHub, there's also chat on Discourse and Matrix, which is like a federated chat system I'd never heard of. But it's, like the committee members, as well as like a lot of random other people are on there talking about new ideas, existing proposals, what's going on. So that's sort of the ecosystem. The process, the actual process itself is well documented. You can go to the TC39 website or GitHub and read about how this works. But it's basically a 5-stage process if you count the first stage here. And I'm going to walk through the proposals and some of the proposals and what stage they're at, and hopefully not bore you guys too much. So stage 0 is basically like, hey, I have an idea. I want a new feature in JavaScript. And you write it up enough to where you like send it to somebody on the committee, and and they sort of document like, yeah, we have a stage 0 proposal from so-and-so. There's really no entry requirements to that level, other than, like don't be a complete tool. So there is stage 0. There is stage 1, which is where you have you kind of fleshed out the spec a little further, and more importantly, you've got a champion. You've got somebody that is on the committee that goes to these meetings who's willing to champion your proposal for you, because you're probably not pocketing, probably not paying 3,500 or 70 grand a year to do that yourself.
Is that any of those people that are paying that fee can be the champion?
I don't know. I haven't had enough insight. So I think the next step would be to actually try and get something through this process, but I'm not doing that. So that stage 1 is get a champion and flesh out your spec enough where you're not embarrassed showing it to people. Stage 2 is have an actual draft specification developed. So it's really just pushing it the next level further, and getting to where like the committee is actually willing to review it and look at it. And then stage 3, I think stage 3 is really where the rubber hits the road. That's text complete. You've had reviewers, editors have signed off on it, and most importantly, you're getting to where you have an implementation or a polyfill of some sort, where people can actually start to play with this concept that you've developed.
Seems like before even stuff gets to finish, sometimes browsers will just put it in because they know that it's going to.
Well, so that's in this stage 3, stage 4 zone. So stage 3 is like you'll see like in some of these repos on TC39, they'll either reference or they'll have an implementation that you can go play with. Like some people have like Code Sandbox and that sort of stuff, which it's kind of interesting. Like, oh, here's this new language feature, I can play around with it.
Or CodePen.
Or CodePen. Yeah, it's actually an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about like what the most appropriate environment would be. So, but yes, you should use CodePen, all you people online. Right, so stage 2, stage 3, having polyfill available. And then stage 4 is basically you're done. But to get to stage 4, you have to have acceptance tests, and you have to have 2 independent VM implementations. And that mostly means Mozilla and Chrome. Like your feature should be available on a canary build or behind some experimental flag. So once you've hit that point, you're basically done, and your feature will become part of the spec and go out on the next June release of the spec. So so that's the process. And it's like one thing I like about it is pretty open, and and like getting through these different levels is where the sort of the challenge is going to be. But they have a well-documented set of criteria for that.
You know, if you're looking at things like Apple as an alternative, like if Apple adopts their proposal and makes it available in multiple browsers, that they consider that?
I don't know. I mean, I've done enough. I've had enough interactions with standards bodies to be dangerous, I would say. And my sense is that it become like the population of people that are in this community is small enough that it is kind of, I'll say, an old boys network. Like you got to know who they are, you got to have their respect, and so if you come to them and be like, well, I work at Apple, or I know somebody at Apple, and they've agreed to implement this. I don't know. I mean, I think you point at that bullet and go like, well, Apple's a VM, and we got somebody over here at Node or Chromium or somewhere to do it as well. And at that point, you can probably get them to sign off on it. So the pipeline. There's quite a few proposals. I counted 145 in total on the TC39 website. I'm not going to cover all of them because we want to go home and go to bed. But I did find this, so I have this graphic put together of the number of proposals at each stage. And what I find interesting is like they're almost entirely all at stage 1. So they've kind of gotten like, it's easy to come up with an idea and put together a paragraph. It's relatively easy to get somebody to, to go to a committee member and be like, hey, will you be my champion? But then things sort of fall off a cliff. And I think it's because getting from stage 1 to stage 2, you have to actually put work in. You have to ask the committee to review and document. Like that's where sort of the rubber hits the road. And so I think that's where things tend to back up. And I'll just sort of make a brief aside comment here, which is one of the things I found when looking through these proposals is that they fall into 2 broad categories. There's syntax changes, like introducing an optional chaining operator or a pipe operator that I'll get to in a moment, like where you're actually changing the syntax of the language. And those are the things I get most excited about because they have very broad sweeping changes as far as how they affect your day-to-day programmers' lives. And then there's API enhancements like adding a new method to array or something. And those tend to be very targeted and they're kind of interesting, but they're also like, I don't really care about that so much. So if I skew on what proposals I'm presenting here, I'm probably skewing more toward the former, the syntactic stuff, because I find that to be most exciting. And then the last thing that's a little interesting is they don't really they don't consider proposals as being stagnant ever. I actually had I was looking at their list of proposals and they were ordered by like first submission date. And I was like, hey, why don't you guys order these by like the last time you actually looked at them in the committee, because that would be interesting. And the response I got was, well, there's like, that would imply that some of these proposals are like inactive or stagnant, and they're not. They're just the champion or the author hasn't had time to work on them. And I was like, all right. So there's a lot of, you got to sort through the wheat, sort the wheat from the chaff here, in terms of like what's actually going to be coming down through the pipeline. And that's hard to get a sense of, or at least it was for me. Right, so what is in the proposals? It's been a long evening, and we gotta. This is where the fire hose comes in, and I apologize. I'm gonna start walking through this stuff I found interesting. I'll hopefully do it fast enough that it's not too boring. And some of this I found really exciting. Like, one of the things I was gonna say earlier, like this period that we're in, where JavaScript evolves every year, where we're seeing new stuff like async await hitting, coming to the table, like the pipe operator. Like, I love that stuff. It makes coding a real joy, and it makes JavaScript a language. I think I don't know if it's unique. I don't know how many other languages have this same sort of like agile pipe, standards pipeline. But it's pretty cool being on the receiving end of that, and getting to play with these new features and seeing them come out. It is sort of Beyonce's yearly release. So, all right, stretched. We got that out of the way. In we go. So, stage 0. This is the stuff that just sort of random ideas that people have put in there, and in particular, it's the stuff that I'm going to just say is stagnant. It's stuff that has not been reviewed in the last 4 years. And I'm providing this mostly as this is one end of the spectrum. And there is another end here, which is the stage 4 stuff. So just to kind of give you guys a sense of what is and is not in the pipeline. So we have additional meta properties for ES7. For those of you who've been doing JavaScript long enough, you'll remember there was actually a day you could call callee and count and arguments on a function to get like the number of arguments or what function called you. And it was, that may or may not still work, but this was a proposal to standardize that. Hasn't been reviewed in 4 years. Defensible classes, I don't even remember what this was. I looked at this like 4 weeks ago. I think it's something like, basically structs, but with a class syntax. There is a syntax for basically doing a function.bind. So I want to call this method, but in the context of this object. Pretty cool. There's actually a different proposal for that I think has superseded that, which is why that's not particularly relevant anymore. There's a proposal for decorators. There's a newer one that supersedes that. What's that? Yeah.
6 years.
Even the new one?
Oh, I don't know.
But I found 2. There's one at stage 0 and one at stage 2, I think. There's nested import declarations, so the ability to basically have scope imports. Again, another one's been superseded. This class properties modifier, where you say like my own x equals 9. There were a few other operators in that proposal, and it was a little ambiguous, like what exactly they were trying to do there. So. Yet more, function is callable and is constructor. Conceptually, I don't know what that would mean. Like every function is a constructor, so I don't know how you would differentiate between the two. There's a relationship syntax. I actually thought this was interesting, and I want to go back and reread that. It was basically the idea you could say, this object has a relationship to this object through this property. And I was like, it's kind of databasey and might be interesting. So I'd have to dig into that a little bit more to really understand like what value there might be. The nice thing about these proposals is that the authors do typically provide some context for like why they think a feature is a good idea. So I found those to be kind of fun to read through. There is a structured clone method, and God, I want one of these. Like, I would love to have a way of just saying clone some object, other than like converting it to JSON and then back to an object. But that hasn't been reviewed by the committee in 8 years, so that's going nowhere.
Is that a deep clone? Is that what that
Yeah. Yeah, so like I've got a deeply structured object and I want to clone it.
So that means that hasn't gotten a champion?
It hasn't. Yes, that's correct.
It's at stage 0. Like how that seems like a freebie.
Don't shoot the messenger.
No.
It's political, right? And it's like if you can do that with Lodash, right?
Well, and I think what happened. Well, yeah. So like Lodash has a deep clone. Like we've all written deep clone.
JSON does stringify.
Yeah, JSON.stringify, parse and stringify, right? But when you dig into that problem, to actually like, how do you, like, I'm gonna hand you an arbitrary object that has regular expressions and DOM elements and, you know, and URL objects and sockets. Like, deep clone that. Like, okay, well, and so I think you do, like when you actually write a standard, you get bogged down in the minutia. And that's where things get sticky.
I feel like the pattern for that's just make it the prototype. There's a lot of, I don't want to crack open that.
You should jump into that repo and have at it.
I was.
And come back next year when you emerge from that swamp. So.
I mean, it's interesting too, like looking back at like who attends the meetings, it's always some of the same people, but a lot of different people.
I have not looked through that, so yeah.
It's interesting, it's like the same people, and then there's like totally different people.
Yeah, that's probably different. Like that's probably different. You know, different authors are like, "Hey, I've got a great idea," and then they sort of, you know, stand up in front of the wall and the committee and they kind of get shot down a little bit.
Yeah. And it seems to be like the pattern was every quarter for like 3 days. And
It's once every 2 months.
and it's like a couple of days, right? Because they have
Yeah.
meeting notes in like multiple days.
I don't know.
Yeah. So they keep all the notes on repo.
Oh, well, there you go.
There's like 262 repos on there.
Yeah, it's you know, it's a significant body of stuff to work through. Destructuring assignments, like we've already got destructuring. This is a slightly different notation. I don't know that there's enough value there that's ever going to get to a stage 1. Unify object and import destructuring soon. Oh, as pattern. I don't even know what this is. I lost my website. Okay, go back. All right. So actual stuff in stage 0 that I think has a chance. Async context. So when you throw an error in Chrome or Node, you get these deep stack traces that show the asynchronous context in which that error happened. This is a proposal to standardize that, basically require that all JavaScript VMs provide that. So again, sort of this switch from standards bodies as gatekeepers to standards bodies as documenting existing behavior. So I think that's kind of interesting.
It gets so political when they just don't get, right? Because it's like Chrome is sitting there as like the big bad guy, and they're like, well, we have the most users, so.
But you can also look at it from Chrome's standpoint as like, well, you know, our problem is solved. Like we don't really care.
Oh, yeah, I guess.
You know.
Every other event.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know.
Either that or they come in saying, that's not happening, but.
Yeah. And then, at the other end of the spectrum is basically add an argument to the trim function that lets you trim out something other than white space. I was like, that seems really useful and obvious and, you know, and like super low hanging fruit. So let's just push that on through. We'll see how many years that takes. All right, so that's stage 0. That's, you know, the sort of the swirl of miasmatic ideas. Stage 1, accepted. So these are ideas that have champions and that people have done at least, you know, a little bit more work on the drafts. Brief interlude for the distribution of how long it's been, or rather the last year the committee looked at these proposals. So you know, this is the stage where, you know, all those proposals are sort of backed up. And you see that, you know, it's been a couple of years at least for the vast majority of them. So there's not like, you know, every meeting there's, you know, proposals are coming back again and again. It's like years between appearances, at least for the majority of this. Again, you know, if it was me, I'd be like, you know, sort of sweeping some of this stuff off the table. You know, it makes you know, the life of people that want to do presentations on this stuff a lot easier. You know, all 3 of us. So anyways, stage 1 highlights. Type extensions. I'm actually I don't know whether or not to be excited about this or not. So this is basically a proposal to take everything possible from TypeScript that you can put into JavaScript without requiring the VMs to change their behavior. So it's basically stuff we could strip out before we pass it to a VM, but that will allow people to provide type information. And standardize that. And I'm like, that's a really neat idea. I think it would be really beneficial. Because as a very reluctant and now adamant convert from JavaScript to TypeScript, types are great. I thought I was a really good JavaScript developer, and it turns out I was a really shitty JavaScript developer. I just got away with a lot. So I think that's a really interesting idea, but it's one of those things where I'm not sure if the middle ground is the best of both worlds or the worst of both worlds. And and hopefully this sort of stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 vetting process will, the community will figure that out. Another call this operator. So, again, another function.bind property where you can say, oh, I'll call I want to apply the toString function to the val object. I'm not. It's kind of neat. It's something that everybody does, and I wouldn't mind seeing it. But I'm also not entirely convinced we need it these days. Arrow functions seem to do a pretty good job of that in a lot of cases. There is a proposal for structs, it's basically a class with constraints. So you can't have functions. You can't modify. I forget what it is. You have to initialize them. They can't be modified afterwards. Something like that. So sort of interesting, kind of super interesting. I just don't know if it's going to have legs. Pattern matching this is basically a switch statement on steroids. So instead, with a switch statement, you have to provide a target value, and then your case statements basically have to equal that value. And this is more it's more a switch statement with expressions. So I've got I've got a target, and and if it equals these values or this range of values, it allows you for a little bit more latitude in terms of how you describe your case statements. And I'm like, that would be really cool. I would love to see that. Another module fragments proposal. So basically allowing you to, not just within a file, not just on a file basis, but within a file, create modules that can be imported. And I think there's even one more of these in a later stage. So don't be surprised if we see that. I forgot which slides are which. There's an async do command, which is kind of like an async for loop, or the for await statement. So being able to do loop on asynchronous promises. Be interesting. Built-in modules. This one's kind of near and dear to my heart, only because I can't do a presentation without mentioning UUID. The author of this proposal reached out to me like 6 years ago and said, hey, we want UUID to be the test case for this. So that was actually how the crypto.random UUID API started, was as a nominal built-in module. So the idea is that is basically that JavaScript, the language, would specify certain modules that you would be able to require or import, and that would be consistent across all VMs. So things like UUID. It's basically sort of a holding pen for APIs, I guess. I'm not sure that's actually going to go anywhere. Certainly the experience that we had with UUID was that it bounced from one standard body to another until we found a home with it was the WICG. I forget what that stands for. But it seems like there's better standards processes for that sort of thing, rather than using this built-in modules and syntax. So I don't know if that's going to go anywhere. Yeah, so that's stage 1. I'm going to take a little pause for more here. I should have another stretching guy. All right, stage 2. So this is where I hope things get more interesting, because I find that as we get further and further along, the ideas develop more substance. So, for example, throw expressions. Hopefully you guys can see that red stuff. I'm not sure that was the best choice of font. But right now, when you throw something, it has to be a statement, like just throw this. And it's if you want a conditional, you have to have a conditional code around it. In this case, for example, you can have a function that takes an argument where the default value is to throw an error. So if you call that function without an argument, like that's an instant error. Similarly, you can have a ternary statement where if A is not truthy, you throw an error. So it's you know, it's basically like you can do this with if statements. It's not a big deal. So this is just some tactic sugar to make that sort of thing easier. Kind of cool. Function implementation hiding is an interesting one, but I think the use cases are pretty narrow. So in much the same way you can put use strict at the top of a file to enable strict mode for VMs, this would allow you to put hide source at the top of a function to tell VMs not to expose the source code of that function. So if you do function, like if you have a reference to a function and you stringify that, you get the source code to the function. And so, or not, I don't know. It's because you can, if you have access to the URL that the source is pulled from, then you can then all bets are off.
Yeah.
But if you have like a script injection that where you can actually start where you get access to the runtime functions, I don't know. Like I said, it's a bit of an edge case. Like it probably mitigates some security exploits, but I don't know. It's stage 2. We'll see if it makes it to stage 3.
It's like the Cheeto and the door latch lock.
Yeah.
It makes some people feel better.
The locks to keep the honest people out of it. But
Maybe I don't know. I mean, this would be worth reading the proposal and understanding the problem space a little bit more. I'd say before coming to too many opinions.
it got to stage 2, so probably us in this room.
Yeah,
It's probably been thought of
Exactly.
a little bit more than
Exactly.
us yahoos.
So, all right, more stage 2. New set methods. I want these because doing an intersection or union or difference of sets is a pain in the butt. I mean, you have to convert them to convert them to you can do it. I just don't remember how, and I have to think about it every time. And I don't want to write that code again. I'm done. Give me intersection, union, and difference functions, please. There's a collection coercion. I thought this was interesting. It's an interesting idea where basically when you create a map, today you just give it an entries and you get a map with those entries. The proposal here is to take a second argument where you provide a couple coercion functions that allow you to mutate both the keys and the values as part of creating the set. So it's shorthand for doing a map, but doing a map function. But to do a map function, you have to convert your map to an array, and then run the map, and then convert it back to a map object. There's another proposal that addresses this, so this may not be quite as important or quite as relevant as we think. One thing I did see is that there's a lot of overlap on proposals. So some proposals get superseded by others. So it's a bit of a swirl, which is kind of neat. And speak of the devil, the next one is iterator helpers. This is actually a cool idea. So it's basically if you have an iterable that's not an array, like the result of a generator function, it's to provide sort of corresponding capabilities to the array function. So where you can do array map, filter, sum, and there's a few additional ones here. You can run it's to provide functions that you can just run generators through directly. So it allows you to treat streaming data as actual streaming data rather than having to convert it to an array to take advantage of this. And there's all sorts of examples of where you might have sort of infinitely long data. It's kind of a neat idea, and I think these would be a good addition. Record and tuple objects as immutable analogies to object and array. If you buy into the immutable data structure model of programming, which I think has a lot of benefits to it, this is going to be super interesting. I've done enough stuff in that space that I think that I'd love to see these. So, more stage 2 highlights, module blocks. So this sort of supersedes that. I think it was the stage 0. We saw a module proposal, a module block proposal. So you create a module. You can pass the reference to that module around and use the dynamic import statement to actually import it. It's kind of a neat idea. I don't know what that does to tree shaking. I'm guessing it breaks things, but I'm not entirely sure about that.
What is tree? I'm not familiar with that.
Tree shaking? Tree shaking is dead code removal. So it's basically when you have a bundler Like you point a bundler at your project and you say, my entry point is index.js and this file over here. And then you've got the other 800 JS files in there that aren't referenced anywhere by that code. Tree shaking is the process by which that bundler will walk through your code. It'll parse the code, see what it's calling, and then ignore everything else, so that you end up with an optimized bundle that doesn't have like all that extraneous stuff. The problem, briefly, is that JavaScript is terrible for that sort of thing because it's so dynamic. So it's static time, like statically parsing a JavaScript file to understand what code is and is not called is a really difficult, if not impossible, problem. And it only works with it doesn't work with common JS because you can provide dynamic strings as arguments, so you just don't really know what's being required. But ESM, the ECMAScript module system was built with that in mind. It's why you have to provide string literals when you import something. It's so that the files can be parsed statically and allow for this sort of thing. So yeah, so that's basically in a nutshell what tree shaking is. And I don't know what this does to that process. The pipe operator. I really like this. So if you have nested function calls, like you want to take a predicate and pass that to a callback, and then pass the results of that to negate, and then pass the results of that to filter, you end up reading this from right to left, which is very counterintuitive, and it's just confusing. So there's a new pipe arrow operator where you just say, take the results of this function and pass them into this next function using a % operator to denote the result of that operation.
It just ends again.
It's but not without, I mean, yes and no.
I get it, but usually
Yeah.
I feel like that it just ends up being that same kind of
Yeah, but if for functional programming, this sort of thing is fantastic. Like it turns JavaScript into, I think, I don't know, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it turns it into a first-class functional programming language. And any like truly functional programmer would, I'm sure, be rolling in their grave over that. So, yeah, well, no, not at all.
It's saying biz again. Like I encounter biz all the time in consulting. Like some of the companies still operate under that. Just call back L with biz.
I don't know. I found that you can't, like, I still write then statements, even like within async, like even within async functions. I'm like, there's just certain times that they make sense. So
One side note on that, the first class functional language, since ES6, they were supposed to have a tail call optimizations. And that was something no browser ever did, and they all claimed 100% ES6 compliance a few years later, even though it was only 99.99, right? But at some point, this is something to look into, right? I feel like they all slipped it in there and never told anybody, because I feel like I get a tail call optimization.
I only vaguely understand
It's just
tail.
where you call like a recursive function, and instead of just blowing out the stack, it sort of like unwinds your code and does it like
Right.
procedurally, that type of thing.
Yeah.
But it's just something that blows my mind, because I remember it was always the last little red thing that was never done, and I felt like, why don't you guys do this? And then a couple of years ago, or maybe a year ago, I just tried it in like Chrome or Firefox, and I felt like it was there. Anyways.
Yeah. So, yes, and some of these proposals are sort of targeted at compiler optimization. Not many, but I think there's one or two in here that we'll see that have that same sort of feel to them, of like, oh, it's the compiler guy saying, like, if you could get users to do this, it would make our ability to run fast code that much easier. But those tend to be few and far between. How are we doing here? Oh, we're only 20 minutes over schedule. So it goes faster, I promise. Stage 3 candidates. So these are, I thought I had another, oh, I did. Watch this. Coming soon to a browser near you. Actual support. That's stage 3 candidates. I was like, where the hell did I put those bullet points? So that's the best thing about animations and presentations is you get to watch the presenter react to them.
Something in 2017.
Yeah.
That's when they were last presented.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. It really is, which is why there's only like 4 that made it to my slide about in
That's
stage
why I'm
4.
going through the GitHub stages, they're all, everything's posted right there, so I'm not on that one.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I get it. You don't care.
So these have at least one
We haven't done it.
implementation?
No, these have the criteria here is basically a polyfill.
Okay.
Like you have to have something people can play with.
So this would be like a Babel.
Yeah, a Babel plugin.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting that the contributors, a lot of, well, I can say a lot, but like, from what I've seen thus far, some of the contributors are also people that are on the board.
Yeah.
So it's like these committees
Oh,
are
sure.
like, they're like their own champions, and they'll have like one person that's not on the committee.
Yeah, I mean, it gets
But
on.
it makes sense because you like Google and Apple.
Yeah, and you know, and
It's just like if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
You know, well, so hold on a second.
For an
You could,
entire team of 5,000 people, we're gonna put it into the spec.
yeah. I mean, so I think it's easy to sort of adopt that, like, well, it's just this sort of very incestuous relationship. I don't actually think that's the case. I think it's more that, like, it takes a certain personality to be a standards person,
Yeah.
and you have to care deeply about this stuff because you're going to take a lot of darts from a lot of people.
That's why their names and faces are protected from like you can
So-
find them.
Well, no, it wasn't that I couldn't find them. It's that it becomes, you know, you go onto these, you know, you go onto discourse or I actually didn't find the meeting notes section. Like, that would probably be a little-
It's right there. It's like one. It's a reload. All of you.
Yeah. So, anyways, so yeah, you could probably go look at the meeting notes to see who the attendees are. But it went from this sort of very, you know, established and small committee to being much more open-ended, like, well, you know, ECMAScript members and people that participate in discourse or matrix chats. It's like, okay, who is and is not really reviewing these? So, and it's you know, it's an open process, and the people that are doing it, I genuinely believe are really smart and really passionate about this. So it's not a
Designed by committee.
it's well, kind of
Yeah.
it is.
But it is. But I mean, if you would think the point is like, if you're in charge of like a team of like managers and like engineering managers that are managing fleets of engineers, and they're trying to make their lives easier, they have like a vested interest like in their day-to-day life or boards to make this part of that.
3 companies in the trench coat.
Yeah, I mean, but these companies are like, these are all like main companies. Like, if you go on the list, it's like contributor, like, there's maybe one other person that's also not their own champion of their own thing.
Yeah.
Which means that not only are they on the committee, but they're also submitting their own code to try to get into.
Well, yeah. So I think it would be interesting to pick one proposal, you know, nullish coalescing, and just go read through the meeting notes for when that did come before the committee,
Yeah.
and see what happened and who commented on it, because you know it's like this is important. JavaScript affects millions of people, and I think the end result actually, you know, stands for itself. It is a great language,
Yeah.
you know, despite all its warts and flaws, and you know, and it's changing. Have I been going backwards? I have.
I think Brendan Ike's still on the committee.
Is he?
Yeah, he's somebody who I feel like he oversees a lot of engineers, so to speak, but I feel like he'd be a human person, like this person who nothing's
Barely use them.
Okay. All right.
You know, if you wanted to get something.
I just got this animation one more time.
Is that IE that you got highlighted?
No, that is Firefox.
Okay.
So this is actually the group operator, which was kind of my favorite of all of these. Is just starting to hit browsers. So stage 3 stuff that we're starting to see it come into the VMs. So it's either polyfills or maybe one VM is, you know, they've convinced, you know, some committee member convinced one of their coworkers at Mozilla to drop this into Firefox. But this stuff is like, there's starting to be real substance here. By the time you get to stage 3, like you're pretty much going to get to stage 4 at some point, I think. Let's just rip through this because I know we're running late. Import assertions in JSON modules. This is basically a nod to the fact that in Node with CommonJS, you can require a JSON file and get that data structure, which is a great and super useful feature, but not currently possible with ESM. Actually, you're starting to see this in some browsers. So you basically just provide the MIME type, and it allows you to do that. So there is a temporal API as an improvement to the date. So if you do anything with dates and calendars, like this is going to be your bread and butter. I believe it has nanosecond resolution. I don't know. That's not to say that when you call it, you're going to get time down to the nearest nanosecond, because I actually did the math for this. If you go outside this building, your time will be different due to the light speed. Like you'll have to actually get into an argument about whether or not the time here versus the time in the street is the same. So nanosecond resolution time is a little silly.
We're already over.
But one of the issues is with the date object, you're representing that with a double precision float, which doesn't have the integer resolution needed to represent a lot of dates. So this uses BigInt as the underlying number format. So yeah, it's basically date on steroids.
Does it count for leap seconds? I'm just kidding. The worst problem to solve in computing, I think, is dates.
Oh, yeah.
Like period.
Yep.
It's called more like yes.
Yeah. Shadow Realms. This would be a good presentation all on its own. I haven't done enough to read through this, but you know, there is a problem that, like, it's really nice. It would be really nice to allow users to provide JavaScript snippets that you could run on their behalf. You don't dare run user-submitted JavaScript on their behalf on your system, because there's just too many ways that it can break out of that sandbox and mess up your code. So Shadow Realms, I believe, is a solution to that. Isolated runtime subsystems. Kind of a neat idea. And then array grouping, which just makes me giggle. I'm so, like, I've written this code so many goddamn times. You have an array of things. These things have a property. You want to group by that property. So you get an object with the group key and then an array of the items in that array that match that. Like, that is this function. Please, just like, I've written that 3 times in the last 3 years. And it's just like, oh. So yeah, like that one can just become stage 4 tomorrow, and I would be happy. Decorators. This is decorators. It's basically the way to sort of syntactically say, I want to wrap this function in that function, and off you go. I'm not going to dwell on that, even though that is my largest code snippet in this presentation. And then there's errata. There's just some random stuff that none of which was very interesting, and I don't know why I have this in the slide, but I'll run through it. Legacy regular expression stuff. The ability to put a shebang, a pound bang, user bin end at the top of your script and not have it break the parser, so that you can actually have server-side scripts that don't have to have special treatment. The asynchronous atomic await. It's basically a wait, but on a memory location rather than on a promise. So to allow sort of interaction and blocking between worker processes, I think. I have to read more on that. A growable array buffer. I guess array buffers are not mutable currently, so interesting feature. Adding find last and find last index methods to the array. Some v-flag thing for regular expression. I didn't dive into that one too much. And then changing arrays by copy, also another thing I need to dive into. As you can see, a lot of these are mostly API type stuff as opposed to syntactic. So again, I just don't care enough to really make those at the top of my 145 proposals that I'm going to drill into this presentation.
Those are easier to get through than syntax stuff. Seems like it would be more opinionated, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's going to have much broader impact. So API stuff, I think API stuff is just easier to rationalize around. So the discussion's easier. Finished. All right, we're almost there. And remember, this is, to be in stage 4, you have to have 2 mainstream implementations. So most of this stuff will be in Mozilla and Chrome. A lot of it will be in Node. So already it's waiting to be part of the next release, which should be any day now. And there's not a lot. So there is a top level await. So no more having to create a self-invoking function just so you can call await on stuff. That would be nice. Class fields, so this, basically the ability to put x equals 0 as shorthand for this dot x equals 0 in the constructor. It's really just bringing JavaScript class notation up to par with the other languages. There is an at operation on all indexable classes. What's that? It works on strings and arrays, so indexable. And objects, it's not going to be on an object, like a native object.
I think it supports negative indexes too.
It does.
Like, finally, you're like, yes, I can get the last or second.
Right, so that's the main thing, is that the problem with array indexing is that it just gets converted to a string. So you can't actually pass a negative number to say, like, I want to index from the end of the array. And I think that was really the impetus for this. It works with strings as well. So it's basically doing a negative array indexing. And there's probably some other rationale for it, but that's the main thing. What else? Static blocks in classes. This is actually interesting. So you basically just have a block and you declare it as static. And that's inside your class declaration, and that gives you two things. That block gets run when the class is loaded, so it just runs once. This property is your class object, so you can annotate your class with properties inside your class declaration rather than having to do it sort of below. Like, I don't know how many of you used to do like, function foo, and then at the bottom is like foo dot some constant equals something else, because now you finally have that foo instance. So it's basically a way of just declaring your class in a single class block, which is nice. But more importantly, I think, is that it's scoped to the class. And so any private instance variables will be accessible to any functions that you declare inside that. So you can annotate your class with a helper function that can take instances of the class and inspect those and see the private state. Whereas anything outside of that class will not be able to. So that makes sense.
That's a lot of big words.
It's basically providing proper scoping for private instance variables.
I think that was last year's stage.
What's that?
Private accessors or private.
Oh yeah, so private properties on classes, and now they're like, well, we should probably have this other thing there as well. So, and then I think the last neutral can work. Never mind. If you want the password to our Wi-Fi, there it is. So, and now it's on the internet. That's fucking awesome.
I want to see the end, but unfortunately I didn't drive myself, so my right is here. But
Okay. No worries.
it's a good presentation.
All right, take care of it. And so error causes. So if you call some code like deep in the bowels of your stack that throws an error, like something comes from the MySQL API that you're using, and you catch that, and you want to surface that upstream, you can attach an error as the cause of your error. So it's a standardized way of providing a record of the errors that were generated. So what's that? Yeah. And then, so that was 2022. So those last two slides are what's coming out this year. And then I just wanted to call out a couple things from last year that may not have shown up on people's radar, that only showed up on my radar by virtue of going through this list. Logical assignment operators. I'm struggling to wrap my head around how this would be useful, but you can say A and equals B, and it will do A and basically do A and B and assign that to A. Or similarly for or null coalescing operators. What's that? Really? I use nullish coalescing all the time, but as an assignment operator, I'm like, I'm not entirely sure I get it. I'd have to. What's
React to conditional rendering a lot? Seems like they use that.
Yeah, it's the assignment part that I'm like, So this is something that's going to take a little bit more for me to I have to go figure out use cases for it. Anyways, promise.any is as a nice counterpart to promise.all. So an array of promises, and as soon as one resolves, you get the result, and it doesn't really matter what happens to the rest of them.
We went through and replaced all of our interval awaits with these, because you can set an interval, and like if you want it to wait at least half a second, you can say, that like you need.
Oh, with the promise.any?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's great. You can make 2 promises, and like if you want it to wait at least half a second for some reason, you can do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, so this should be super handy. And then the last, like super obscure, is numeric separators. So if you want to write 1 million and make it clear where the commas go, put underscores, because commas would be too obvious. And so
Internationalization aspects to that, I would assume.
Yeah, a lot of different countries.
yeah, well, and also like putting commas in the middle of your numbers. Anyways, it turns out it doesn't really matter where you put your commas, because they're completely semantically meaningless. It's just a way of for developers to notate like. Yeah, you can do whatever you want. It's still the same number. It's the parser doesn't care. It's just there for display purposes.
That's what Java does too, exactly.
Is it? That's that may have been the inspiration for this. I kind of.
Yeah, JavaScript. Right?
If you want to show off your JavaScript foo, you can start doing that.
Everyone will be very.
Yeah, I just do one E6 and call it done. And that is all. Come on, there we go. All right. The TC39 proposal process in a nutshell.
There's not one proposal that doesn't have the same champion and contributor on the stage for it.
Oh yeah.
They all have that.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm pretty happy with the results. So
Great.
I don't know if there's any questions.
Is there like the Michael Jordan of these proposals where it's like this dude is constantly every year he's putting something through? Is there anybody like that?
I have not looked at the names.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm curious.
Yeah.
Like there's one shot.
You see lots. I mean, you do see a lot of the same names over and over again. So, yeah.
Oh, so TC39 is something